So welcome everybody. I'll just pick up from where John was. Obviously, we've got some audio issues on that side. Welcome everybody from me. Also joined with Fiona, of course, who's lead analyst on the Learning Systems 9 grid. Ian, do you want to move on? Yeah. So just a reminder in terms of things, please play nice. Please use chat to put questions in. We'll obviously be checking those as we go through, and then somebody, whether it's John or somebody else, will be asking those questions at the end. Obviously, the goal here is to spend as much time trying to answer your questions. I'm sure some of you had a chance to read the report and look at the 9 grid already. We're going to start with just some standard intro content, and then we will also then go into obviously a little bit around the 9 grid itself, and then I'll go into your questions. So hopefully that'll all be fairly straightforward. If you've attended one of these before, you'll have heard me talk about this. So I apologize if I'm repeating myself, but the key thing I think it's important for everybody to understand is where the data comes from in the 9 grid. So we can spend a lot of time throughout the whole year, obviously engaging with corporates and vendors and understanding what's going on in the market. We then run each year a major process from scratch, really with going out to the whole market, getting customer input and testimony, doing lots of vendor briefings, doing lots of factual capture and briefings with vendors, etc., and things like this, and just rebuilding it from scratch. So each year the 9 grid is actually zero-based effectively. So we redo it, we redo all the analysis, and we redo all the ratings, etc. So I'm not sure whether that's visible. Do you want to go to the next slide? Who gets included, obviously, is based really on the main vendors that we see being used within our corporate research network and in wider network of corporate organizations. So who are the vendors they are talking about, who are the vendors that they're considering, and who are the vendors they're using, are the main criteria. We're obviously constantly also looking for new players, innovators, etc., that potentially we believe have the potential to be included in that list. So we'll also be hunting for some of the newer specialists and some of the newer suites that are coming along, looking to see who can include it. You can't buy your way onto the 9 grid. It's not a pay-for-play environment. You can also choose to be included or excluded. So this is one of the things where it's purely based on who Fosway believes are relevant for the target reader. Typically, that's an EMEA or internationally headquartered multinational type organization or mid or large corporate entity. The primary point of view, and this is the important thing probably at all of these slides, is the biggest influence on everything is what the customer says about those companies. So it's not based on the vendor input. We use the vendor input for cross-validation, to deepen the insight, maybe to track new innovations that we weren't necessarily aware of or customers hadn't yet adopted. But the overall rating summary is very heavily skewed towards basically who customers are buying from and their experiences with those vendors. The last kind of point from me really is everybody sees the 9 grid diagram, but would strongly recommend that you read the report as well. The report has both the description of the rating system and what makes up a suite and specialist and all those kinds of things, as well, so how to understand the 9 grid, but it also has a fairly extensive set of market and solution trends, some of which we'll touch on today, that can give you insight on basically the way we're looking at the market and what's going on. And these market trends do have a big impact actually in terms of the way we look at the ratings. And as I said, each year those are redone from scratch. So I'd certainly strongly recommend that you read the trends and try and do that, because it'll give you a sense of the context behind what we're talking about. But probably enough from me. Fiona, do you want to hand over to you?
Absolutely. Thank you, David. And hello, everyone. Good to be talking to you. Here's the functional model. This is the Learning Systems functional model for 2024. The eagle eyes that have been watching this for a while will see that actually this hasn't changed from last year. However, there are changes within it. So the top 5 headings that you have across the top there each have subsections, and for this particular year those subsections have not changed. However, inside each of those sections there could be anywhere between 15 to 30 more questions that all the vendors have to provide data that we then use to benchmark against each other. This model was actually changed quite significantly back in 2020 when we did a big piece of research that was to deconstruct the learning experience piece, and when we first started bringing the suites and the specialists onto the grid. So if you move on to the next slide, we'll have a look at this year's 9 grid, and just a couple of things to kind of mention up front. First of all, just a reminder to everybody, and David alluded to this, that actually we zero base this every year. So it's almost as if we take all the vendors off to put them back on. The goalposts will change slightly, and so that you know, with the data that we have from the vendors, and also the as David said, the comments from the corporates, so that it changes. That is zero base, as I say, every year. Our lens is focused on Europe. So there may be people on vendors on this particular grid where, if you were looking at it from a US perspective, you'd say, well, why are they not as or seemingly significant or in a similar position as some of their competitors, when actually in the US they are competing with one another? We are looking at this in terms of Europe and whether there are headquartered customers for that vendor in Europe. And the other thing to kind of really say is that every zone has value, that we it's popular to think, because of some of the other analysts quadrants, for example, that the top right zone is the place to be, but actually every zone has value, and it just depends where you are from a buyer perspective from that side. So just referring back to what we were talking about, I was mentioning about the suites and the specialists. So one of the things that has changed between the 2020 grid and this 2024 is the number of specialists. So it was a 50-50 split back in 2020. Now we've only got a quarter of the vendors on the grid are specialists. And the reason for those changes tends to have been that the specialists have realized that there is a need for a full suite, particularly that mid-market. So you can see it's very busy in that mid-section, the mid-market, and mid-market buyers can only justify having one system. So the idea of having a learning management system and an LXP just isn't something that can be is justifiable. And so many of those that were suites are backfilled with a lot of the functionality of the learning management. But obviously, a lot of the learning management systems have increased their or modified their experience so that it's playing into that particular area. So the other things I just want to say as well, we've got the same number of vendors on the grid as well last year, but 4 came off, 4 went on. The ones that have come on is Adobe, Drillster, Expertus One, and Cypher. So welcome to the grid for those. And actually, just while I have all of you there as the audience, thank you so much for the vendors and the corporates for spending time with us. As David said, it's not pay for play, but there is effort and resource that needs to go into providing us with all the data and the briefings that we have from a corporate and a vendor perspective. So thank you for that. So one other thing I'll just mention before I get onto the headlines is that there has been a number of moves between that mid section up into the higher section. I'll mention some of the specialists first. So we've got the likes of Area 9 and Realize It, who are on the adaptive specialism side, and we see an increase in that. There are others waiting in the wings as well. As David said, we've always got systems on the radar, and they provide us with a lot of the data, but they've just maybe not met the criteria yet. But another of the adaptive systems was Drillster that actually made it onto the grid this time. The other moves that quite significant. So Docebo have moved from their core leader position, where they have been for many, many years, up into the strategic challenger zone. And we've got, we'll maybe come back to in one of the headlines talking about large enterprise learning, and we've got some more research coming out very shortly on that subject. But congratulations to Docebo for the move up from that perspective. So the key headlines. So as David said, please download the report and have a look at what we see as being the market trends and the solution trends. And that top trend, everybody around the world had issues, the economic impact. We know that personally, as well as nations or as companies. And it has also had an impact on the learning systems vendors as well this year. Mixed results though. So some of the vendors have struggled to grow at all. It has almost been a case of those new customers have been hard to find since COVID, and there was an influx of new buyers because they needed to get online. Then there has been this, now they've got their system, you know, now what? Who else is out there that needs the system? But so it might have been no growth, or and sometimes single-digit growth for the customers themselves, but maybe double-digit growth into the revenue side of things, and that could be to do with the an inflation, but it's more likely to be that those vendors are upselling into those existing vendors. So yeah, there was definitely, we saw an impact from the economic situation. AI, so big headline and massive conversations going on about AI. In the past, we've always said that experience was the topic of conversation, or skills, but now AI has been eclipsing that. And within the systems perspective, those vendors that thought maybe last year they could wait a while before introducing AI into their systems now either have, or it's definitely on the roadmap. So, you know, we saw the generative AI revolution, if you like, that was imposed on learning because it came from the wider business world. And so, yeah, it's had a huge impact. And so it leads the conversation. The skills piece is still there. And I mean, we know that AI will be important to, and crucial in fact, to ensure that the skills story actually is successful. It will not be successful about the introduction of AI in that, because we've been through that cycle on a number of occasions over the last 20 odd years. But there are still some unanswered questions. There are lots of pilots that we're beginning to see happening with corporates and vendors looking into this, but the questions on the granularity of the skills, or even who's validating those skills, is still to be determined. And so we're on this journey together. There's, as I say, lots of conversations, and in our the roundtables that we have that John mentioned earlier, we've been talking about skills and AI as well in those roundtables. Rise of LX and demise of LXP. What do we mean by that? So this is talking about how actually everybody is interested and knows the importance of learning experience, and that there's a rise of that, and the questions to us from corporates who are asking us to help put shortlists together in terms of, they're asking for LXPs. And when we dig deeper into what they are actually looking for, then there is not necessarily a requirement for an LXP. We'll maybe come back and discuss that at some point. But what we're seeing is that actually the LXP as a product category, we've never actually recognized that. We've always talked about it as being a title, but as a product category, that seems to be diminishing. And as I said earlier, the mid-market can only afford one system. The learning experience is hugely important to them, as with everybody, but actually they need the existing systems, or certainly the suites, to step up and provide that learning experience as part of the system. And but there is still at that top end the possibility of adding into an ecosystem along with a suite something that can potentially improve learning experience. Is it called an LXP, or are there other specialists that can actually add into that? Then again, it depends on the actual corporate requirement at that time. Okay, and finally, we talk about this need for the mid-market players to step up into this large enterprise vacuum. What do we mean by that? So as Cornerstone has been inquiring, anybody that got close to them on the grid, then as you can see in that strategic leader zone there, Cornerstone is on its own. Where's the competition coming from? It can be from the left side, so from strategic challenger, and until we moved IMC up there and last year and Docebo this year, then really that was a zone that had the HCM vendors there, and it talks about this battle that there is between HCM and best of breed, and that's an ongoing battle, and again we will touch on that in the research that we bring out on large enterprise learning very soon. But also coming up from the core leaders, so from the mid-market, there are also those that are beginning to step up and into that area, either as a suite, or interestingly, some of those that are suites at the moment in the mid-market could actually work as a specialist at that high enterprise, large enterprise level. So it's interesting to see how the market is changing, and again, conversations with the corporates and how they are viewing this has been fascinating over the last few months. So we look forward to sharing more on that shortly. So I'm going to pause there. Do we have any questions coming through? And John, are you all right to?
Just before we do that, I just wanted to kind of take the opportunity to add a couple of extra points on that. So thanks, Fiona, for that. Just a kind of point of clarification. I mean, when we're talking about the vacuum in the large enterprise market, I think what we've seen obviously is Cornerstone acquire the other large enterprise sort of candidate suites, Saba, SumTotal, etc. Obviously, also Edcast recently. And effectively that creating a vacuum in the sense that if you're buying something and it's clearly potentially your HCM solution maybe is a candidate for that, Cornerstone is a candidate, but then who else is? You can't typically go for an RFP with one vendor in it, or even one or two vendors. So that's typically created a bit of a vacuum, which we're starting to see some of the mid-tier players, the core leaders and strategic challengers try and step into. So that's quite interesting. And as Fiona says, we're looking at that a lot in some of the large enterprise research that we're doing. I think an example of that has been Docebo, really, which has always been successful at doing things like customer and partner training in the large enterprise space, but typically not been so much a candidate for the whole strategic learning platform for all internal learning. And that's potentially starting to change, and hence the recognition of that moving up is particularly onto the top band is actually a really quite a big leap for a lot of companies, because there's a big increase in not just the sophistication of the solution sometimes to deal with larger, more complex customers, but also the ecosystem that surrounds them, the partner networks they have, being more global, being able to execute successfully at that level. So that's kind of an interesting play. I think the other thing is obviously it's interesting, the core leader zone particularly continues to be really, really competitive. It's interesting with the market dynamics that Fiona was talking about before, has impacted a little bit of some of those. And in reality, actually, in lots of markets, we're in the process very shortly of announcing our digital learning 9 Grid as well. And one of the things that's coming through quite clearly is companies with single-digit growth are actually doing quite well. A lot of the vendors flatlined last year, so and anybody that's in sort of good double-digit growth is really, has been outgrowing the market, despite obviously a massive growth that we saw during pandemic and post-pandemic period. So the other thing is, I saw there was a question, somebody was asking about Microsoft. So Microsoft is in the potential leader zone as a specialist, focusing around Viva learning particularly, where there's obviously a set of capabilities there, but it's in reality not trying to be the full learning package, if you like. It's typically being part of an ecosystem backfilled with a learning system or and potentially other Alex-like solutions as well. And obviously the big competition, as I said, on the large enterprise node is with the HCM vendors. So Workday and SAP both been very heavily invested in that market for a long time. And Oracle making quite a significant change this year, really, with a big step up with Oracle Grow that was announced during 2023, and a significant kind of growth in, I think, their likely success in the market. So kind of watch this space in some ways with them as well. So those are just a couple of things I wanted to add in. So maybe, John, we can hand over to you, and if we do questions, that'd be great.
Yeah. I'm tethered to my phone now, so signal should be fine. Fingers crossed. I'm going to take them in reverse order. So first of all, Lorenzo, who asked about headless LMSs. It might be worth for some of our audience perhaps to give a bit of an explainer about that, Fiona. But he asked, is there a segment in the LMS market we can look at while searching for a headless LMS? We're actually looking for engines that help us deliver content in a different portal. Seems like he's got quite a distributed requirement. The content process, progress and score will be managed by the headless LMS. Have you got any comments there, Fiona?
So there are a number of the vendors that actually do provide this headless LMS. And what we mean by that, it's how well they can integrate into a corporate's application within a system. So it's almost if somebody is within an application within their own company, and then there's some learning that comes in there, they cannot see that they have moved from one system into the other. It looks as though they're in the same system. So there are a number that do that. Top of my head, I know that Absorb do. They were one of the first to actually provide that headless technology. There is a lot of back room that needs to be done to make sure that works, but and also IMC are another one that actually provide that that headless. David, can you remember? I'm trying to remember if there was any others that came through specifically, but it's more than just integrations. It's more than just the APIs and that kind of thing. There's and I know that actually Thought Industries, they also have that kind of headless piece as well. So
yeah, I mean the key thing with the headless thing, just the clue is kind of in the name, right? So whereas everybody else gets very besotted, and it's kind of interesting when you focus on things like the UX of their applications, they're still assuming that they're the window of access, right? And then I think the moment you then go into a specific business context or line of business applications and so on, the potential to just embed learning behind that and never really ever go and look at the learning system directly is really, really powerful. And as Fiona said there, it's so yes, most companies will have an API option to drive them, but they still to some degree tend to really focus on them being the user interface. That's definitely, I think there's definitely vendors that will push more into that space. You meant obviously when you mentioned Absorb and IMC already, particularly, and I know, for example, with IMC, they were talking about basically building that whole kind of learning architecture behind some front end systems. So, for example, like a supply management system or a partner management system within a set of automotive, sort of dealer network or something like this, where effectively you're just embedding learning as a component of another application. The important thing there is context, right? That you've got to be able to not just launch something, but you have to be able to understand the context of what's going on both sides and be able to connect them together. So doing it well is non-trivial. We also see examples of this sometimes within things like academy sites and public facing. So I think you mentioned 4 industries, obviously, which focus very much around the extended enterprise customer and partner training. Again, that's a really kind of obvious area. So it's not just about branding the front end of the LMS to make it look like whatever the wider website is. It's actually never really seeing the LMS at all. It's just being beheaded behind the scenes, hence the headless kind of label around it. So it's quite an interesting area.
Thank you, David. Andrew Jacobs, good afternoon, sir. The importance of digital learning for frontline, often deskless workers is growing. Are vendors in this space identified as specialist or suite?
Great question. And Andrew, thanks for bringing up the that frontline worker piece, because it is becoming, as you say, absolutely so much more important. I think it started with Exonify, probably before the pandemic. They were talking about being focused on that front line. Often it was within a retail situation. And then again, during the pandemic, everybody needed to make sure that those frontline staff had communications, which often was done through a learning system. And so what then became important was, how do the frontline workers access this content? It wasn't necessarily about what it was they were accessing, it was more about how. And in the past, there'd been a back room somewhere with a PC that might have been the manager's PC that they were doing training on. Now it was important that it was mobile. And so what we're seeing is the need to improve that mobile capability. Again, mobile has been part of the requirement for many, many years, but now it's becoming much more important. And whereas most of the vendors provided some sort of mobile capability, the range in terms of how good that was has been quite significant, and everybody's beginning to realize, because of the frontline workers, the need for that to be improved. And one of the things that I've been asking a lot during the briefings this year is, yes, okay, if the vendors have their the mobile capability, do they have the offline capability as well? So in other words, downloading content onto the mobile, that it can be done when somebody isn't in a Wi-Fi zone or whatever. And that's the bit that's not easy. So not all vendors can. So coming back to your question, Andrew, is it a suite of specialists? It could be either or both. So obviously Exonify is a specialist in what they do in particular, but actually all the suites need to be able to deliver to the frontline staff as well. So so they need to have that. It's more like a mobile capability, I would say. I don't know whether you want to add anything to that, David.
Well, the funny thing was we had a specific point on the last slide, but because we had too many, which was about frontline workers, and we actually took it off. So,
true. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, we've seen this actually across pretty much all the segments, is the shift to focus on frontline worker and to be able to deliver effectively to them. And there are definitely some of the suites have greater capability or focus more on that front line, particularly if they work in retail or hospitality, etc. That tends to be a piece, but also some of the more blue collar environments, aviation and manufacturing and some of those things as well. But you have to create a specific experience aimed at those frontline workers, which is very very slick in terms of the experience you're trying to do. And interestingly, I would say there probably were, when there were more specialists that were standalone, many of the specialists tried to become suites. Or have become suites, which is one of the reasons why that balance has shifted that Fiona was talking about before. And some of those specialists were actually stronger in frontline with doing frontline workers, but became suites. So that's why it's a kind of could be either or both. It's not a clear demarcation based on frontline worker as a specialism. It's more about their ability to do well, but into that space. But frankly, that's become a bigger requirement for all of the vendors to some degree.
Thanks, David. Next question from Jeannie. I don't know how you'll answer this one, but she asks, my company is interested in LMSs with video platforms and an integrated marketplace to expand revenue. Do you have any recommendations? Is that possible?
So video, so just repeat. So wanting a video
platforms and an integrated marketplace within the LMS.
So I think, I mean, I can't give you specific recommendations without going into a lot more detail about what your requirement actually is. But there's a lot of the vendors will have the opportunity to have, I mean, whether it's user generated content or, you know, just video content generally that added into, that's kind of normal. And then in terms of the content piece, then again, I mean, that's probably whether that's a specific third-party vendor that you're looking for. Again, those integrations can actually happen as well on that. I'm not sure I've answered that the way that you'd necessarily want it to. David, do you have any other insights?
No. I mean, I was just going to say there are definitely some of the platforms which have a stronger video capability, and things like in-video search and things like this. Yeah, someone like Fuse, for example, that would be an interesting area. But then it depends on what you mean by marketplace as well, in terms of what you're trying to do. So that's probably a deeper inquiry we should kind of handle more offline, I would think.
Yeah.
Okay. Diane's asked about Cornerstone acquiring various companies and has partly had her question answered in the chat. I don't know whether you can add anything, Fiona, about the companies they've acquired, and have they incorporated their LMSs into one, or have they kept some of them as separate entities?
They are separate. They are still separate entities, and depending on what your requirement is, they will provide you with either the Saba or SumTotal or Cornerstone, whichever one is going to match those needs for you. But also they have the Edcast that can actually fit over the top of any of the three of those as well. So they are all separate at this moment in time. Yeah.
But they call them different things. So they talk about CSX and SPX and things like that as well. So there are multiples. What they call their talent experience platforms or architecture is based on enabling they talk about intelligent tech fabric, which is basically open skills, open content sat above the underlying applications, and then with potentially the LX and opportunity management layer on top. The reality is obviously that you know, within that base, we are seeing some customer change, and I would expect to see a faster transition, particularly say from SumTotal customers. I think the Saba base historically, a lot of those that would have changed. The ones that aren't have often got very deep and complex requirements, and etc. as well. But obviously over time, all of this potentially is a candidate. You know, we can all speculate as to where they would need to go longer term to make that particularly a continued commercial success and continue to grow. But Cornerstone continues to make other acquisitions as well. So don't expect that to be the end of the line.
No, I doubt it. Okay, thank you for that. Michael, I do apologize if I'm pronouncing your first name wrong, asks, L&D and HR departments have been struggling with finding budget in the past few years due to economic uncertainties. Is this trend slowing or changing or quickening up?
So from our digital learning reality survey last year, then we did and have a look at, if you can, on our website, some of the infographics for that, because it actually does talk about what people are seeing. And one of the things that I remember was it's the kind of the decrease in budget has moved from 8% up to 21% who are seeing a decrease in budget this last year. So that was the 2023 digital learning reality survey. And I'm not sure that that's going to change anytime soon, or it's probably going to, you know, either stay the same or increase in terms of the numbers that are finding that budgets are decreasing. Also, there's been a delay in some of the projects and things like that. And but there's still, I think it was actually over 50% that we're seeing no change. So there's still positives out there, and I think it's the question isn't whether the budgets are changing. It is how you show the impact of learning to your C-suite, because the other thing that we found was you were twice as likely to have your budgets increased if you had managed to get the buy-in from the C-suite. So if you got buy-in, then you're more likely to get the budgets, and it was 3 times more likely to kind of get those projects, you know, in advance. So it's about how you show value of what you're delivering using your learning platform and your within learning development.
I mean, the other thing I would do is I would dispute the original statement. I think the pandemic period and the immediate period post-pandemic was a huge stimulus to the whole digital learning and digital HR market. And actually, there was a big accelerator investment, and particularly companies moving to newer cloud solutions. I think what's happened, obviously, is particularly during 2023, real economics reasserted itself post-pandemic, if I can put it like that. And obviously interest rates, and we talk around recession, the reality possibly of recession, particularly in Europe. I mean, it's hard to say the US, as obviously that applies in the US. But obviously what we have seen then is much more of a mixed picture. And as we said earlier, you know, that economic climate has impacted the vendors and some of the things that their decisions they made. Some, particularly the US ones, took cost out very quickly, early 23, late 22 into 23. Others have that's come a bit later. So there's definitely an economic impact there. But I think overall we still see budgets as being relatively resilient, even if there is more mixed picture and more under pressure. And ultimately, learning technology within learning within HR is actually still on it still has a growth trajectory around it, right? So in some ways, the spend has impacted other areas within L&D faster than it's impacted the technology piece, but it's definitely a more mixed picture. But we should be careful to think about, you know, there was a bit of a sugar rush, I think, within the industry because of the pandemic and effectively everything having to go digital. So the realignment after that was a pretty natural thing to happen anyway, I think.
Thanks, David. Just to follow up from Sergio saying he suggests that he'd only use an LMS if there are administrative tasks of learners necessary. Otherwise, it'd be a learning record store with a XAPI tracking. Fiona, would you agree with that?
So just repeat the beginning of that again. So you would only use an LMS
if there are administrative tasks of learners necessary. David, do you agree?
Okay. All right. I see what you're saying. So,
right.
I mean, the learning management is what a learning management system is about, and so it's tasks about those learners. I mean, you are talking about the ability for an LRS to monitor the LXP the XAPI tracking data, and that has got a much deeper level of data and tracking and that kind of thing, which, yes, I agree, there's a lot to do with that. But I would also say there is always going to be some need for some management of the learning at some point, and therefore you're going to need a learning system, because an LRS can't do that. It's only a basically an area for storing data that you can then do analysis on.
Absolutely. So, I mean, in the real world, companies need to be able to manage the learning as an activity within their business. They want to align it to skills, to growth, to compliance. There are still key programs that most companies run, whether that's around leadership or development of one form or another, whether it's transformation projects. All of that requires some kind of structured management activity. And Fiona and I had a long conversation about some other research we're doing earlier on today. And I think the one thing I always come back to the conclusions, because we've heard this so long around the death of LMS, and it's just basically delusional, I think, in reality, because there's no company I'm aware of that can be less compliant in the modern era than it was before, that can turn off the things around managing regulatory learning, mandatory learning, and so on. We live in a world that's more onerous, not less, around that. Whilst we may have significantly moved away from learning being classroom-centric activity and so on, there is still potentially quite a lot of management type activity from a company level that we need to do in the background, and particularly for an enterprise organization. So the idea that you don't need those things, I think, is really a pipe dream. The issue is how do you also generate a lot more, create a better, stronger experience for learners? How do you enable them to take more ownership and be more aspirational, more curious, maybe, or whatever it is? How do you enable all those other things to go on, push more of the responsibility to learners to drive their own learning agenda? These are all hugely important, but it's not a one-dimensional, one-side-only view. And as I said, in the real world, I think all of that stuff is required, which is one of the reasons why, even the companies that generally a few years ago thought that they could be just a specialist around the LX story or around an AI story or whatever it is going to be, nearly all of them have found that they have to backfill learning management functionality. And in reality, the majority of the suite, the whole of the suite story now, is really around the ability to combine both of those worlds and do that reasonably well. Even if the learning management requirements are lighter touch than they were in the past, they still exist.
Okay, thank you, David. We're going to talk about ecosystemness now. So this is quite a general question, maybe about assessment on the grid and how this is done. So Fiona, Andrew's question is, there's a growing emphasis on ecosystemness. How is successful implementation and integration included in the assessment? Can you share anything without giving away too much?
So thank you again, Andrew, for this question. I think it was a word that was coined a few years ago by Mr. Wilson there, ecosystemness, and it's the ability to be part of an ecosystem for that vendor. And yes, it is so important that now there is connectivity across any of the systems, whether it's HR to learning system or whatever, because you need that data flowing, and more that is going to be important. As we're talking about skills, without good data in the right place at the right time, then it's none of that's going to work. And what we actually do find, and I'm not sure whether this is answering your question particularly, but what we do find is when we're, when I alluded to before, whether somebody comes to us and asks for, we need an LXP, or, provide us with a shortlist, then actually we can, in some cases, see that the way the existing system has been implemented and how well it's connected actually affects massively the learning experience of each of the individuals, the learners themselves. And so it is hugely important. It's not, a lot of the vendors have gone down the route of, because I mean, all of them are able to say there's an API for that. We can, yes, okay, but we haven't, a lot of organizations don't have access to IT departments to be able to do that API integration. And therefore having connectors and being able to, for a learning professional to be able to do the integration, a lot of them are beginning to use Wikato as a connector. Those sorts of connectors are automatic and so important, and therefore they are all beginning to do that. And but whether it's being implemented that way comes back to whether the buyer is trying to cut corners when it gets to the implementation phase. You might think, right, we've got the learning system, but if you cut corners at the implementation stage, it's going to come back and bite you a few years down the line. You absolutely need to do that. So hopefully that answers the question.
The other thing that the other thing I think worth adding there, I mean, so when we started talking about ecosystemness, what we realized is this actually came again originally from the deconstruction of learning experience as a story. And what we realized was the thing that drove experience, or what the LXPs were typically trying to do, was to provide a much more personalized, obviously learner-focused view of the learning activity and the opportunities for it from anywhere in the learning ecosystem. And actually it was the ability to pull together intelligent, sometimes skills-based, some very kind of personalized, nice UX type stuff, nice learner experience, together with the ability to connect the ecosystem, that became really important. And when you started to think about it like that, and the reason I started talking about ecosystemness was, you know, we were talking about APIs and interoperability and kind of standards and a whole bunch of different things. And in reality, it was kind of very technical, and what he was doing was hiding the reality. The reality is how well a system enables you to connect across your ecosystem, and the ability for you to leverage that ecosystem automatically without, as Fiona said, needing to have APIs are not an answer if you don't have an integration team. And even if you have an integration team, managing integrations and upgrades to integrations over time is hideously expensive. And even the largest companies realized that a long time ago. So being able to move beyond that into automatic connectors and being able to look at workflows and the way they went across. And when you started thinking about ecosystems as a characteristic, it really started to differentiate the solutions. Some were really actually very focused around that and how they fit into the wider ecosystem. And at the end of the day, within learning, it's always an ecosystem. It's never a single system, right? HR is always an ecosystem. It's never a single system, even if you're using a strategic HCM platform. How you make that work is really important. The question was about how we assess it. So we actually, within, for example, the functional capture process that we run with the vendors and so within customer briefings, we're talking about it all the time. Within vendor briefings, we're talking about it. But actually within the functional capture, we explicitly look at how solutions connect across the learning ecosystem and across the wider business and HR ecosystem. And we constantly keep refining that. So it's actually built into the functional model as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, true.
Okay, just less than 10 minutes left. We've got time for a few more. Neil Ryan, this is more of a comment from Neil, but wondering if you have any reflections, Fiona. He says, maintaining a sustainable content library, we can now point AI or automated tagging at. It seems more and more important to be able to do that. He'd like to see a viewpoint on learning content within these systems with the proliferation of authoring tools and AI assistants on the rise.
Yeah, so I mean, we've always said that a learning system is no use to anybody without the content, and quite a number of vendors are adding either or both a library that is their own library, or making sure that they are integrated again with some of the bigger libraries. But actually what I've seen over the last few years is an increase in the number of tools that are allow the individual to create content. So it's usually a fairly simple, we're not talking about an authoring tool that a learning professional would necessarily use, but they are, you know, it is some systems like, I mean, we've got Docebo, IMC and Absorb, who have authoring tools that are separate and can be sold separately. The rest have usually got something internally that, and I'm thinking about, I mean, 360 Learning for a long time have focused on that SME content creation piece. And even now they have got what they're in the marketing, I think they're calling Robin. So it's like, you are Batman, you have got a sidekick Robin to help you create content, and it's an AI based and has prompts in there to make sure that your content that you're creating is pedagogically correct, etc. So I think what I mean, it's absolutely important that there is content and it's available and it's connected well. How it's going to move over the coming years because of AI, then I might just defer that to my colleague Miles and what he's going to be bringing up in the digital learning grid and the report that is going to be published fairly shortly from that perspective, because that's an area that he will be looking at very much. But from a systems perspective, the creation of content within the system is on the increase massively.
David, anything to add?
No, I mean, we're clearly seeing AI as a major a major component of the story around, particularly obviously automatically tagging content against skills and the ability to, I mean, there's so many things that are going to go on there. You know, I mean, what's interesting, especially with the introduction of Gen AI capability in there into these systems as well, both in terms of, for example, trying to change the way in which you even find and access content, as well as how it's tagged and as well as how it's maybe tagged against skills, and then how that drives the personalized recommendation engines, etc. There's a huge amount of change here, but it's definitely a critical piece of the story, and the learning systems have got to work out how they play in that story. Interestingly, it's also probably an ecosystem story, not a single system story. So learning is not the only piece of the corporate equation that's trying to own that as well. So some of that AI mapping is much wider than learning. And that's also an interesting, how you synthesize that together is an interesting challenge. Sorry, lots of interesting.
Yeah, I've just noticed Ryan's come back on that a little bit, and he's talking about interoperability. And I think that is another issue that's happening at the moment, is a lot of these authoring tools within the learning systems are not interoperable. So you are likely to have content that if you want to change systems, you wouldn't be able to move the content from that system into another one. That said, the counter to that being a negative, the counter to that is that well, how often should you be updating the content? And with the AI, could generative AI actually create a new piece of content for you in a new system? That's again something that's likely to develop over the next few years.
Okay, thank you, Fiona. I think we've got time for one more quick question. This could lead to some recommending. I'm sure we've got a few points and papers around this, perhaps. But John Turner has asked, do you have any data on what are the top features learners want from their learning system? Fiona.
I suppose the top request is good experience for the learners. I'm not sure there isn't necessarily a feature. It's putting me on the spot now for that. But I think going back to something that David said earlier, I think the compliance piece and mandatory learning is not going to go away. And if you can do that in a way that makes it as easy as possible for the learner, actually I'll work into this something that is a little bit of a hobby horse for me at the moment, and that is the adaptive learning piece. I think that what a lot of learners want is not to be patronized by the learning that they're being delivered. In other words, they want to learn, but they don't want to have to repeat stuff that they already know. And therefore using adaptive learning to make sure that you're only delivering what they need to know minus what they already know is actually crucial for that. Whether, and that's it's actually more likely to be a specialist piece rather than a feature of a learning system from that perspective. But yeah, that would be my quick answer to that. David, do you want to?
I think, John, I know we've got to go on because we're obviously going to just got a couple of slides to close. But the one comment I make is it completely depends who the learner is. If somebody exists within as a frontline worker, they don't have access to dedicated devices to access this. We can get all carried away with discovery-based learning and personalized learning recommendations. Lots of people, what they want is the easiest route to complete whatever mandatory learning they have, so they can do their job, get paid, and go home. So I think one of the things that I would say to everybody is when you think about it, we can end up getting to a discussion around what drives the experience of people, and ultimately that often drives what their priorities are. But the experience that different people look for is contextually specific to them. And that's one of the things we easily get into this trap of thinking there's one model of what learning experience looks like, for example. It's just not true. And I think thinking about how we understand the needs of our audiences and what really drives what great looks like for them is a really critical task. And that's one of the reasons why I think we need to get beyond this sort of slightly one-dimensional view of what LX means within the learning systems, with the learning ecosystem. So, but I suggest we kind of close up on that note.
Yes.
Close off.
Yeah, next slide, please. Back to corporate membership to quickly remind you, this gives you inside access to more detailed research, benchmark reports, private corporate roundtables, also Fosway's accelerated buying support to align stakeholders, validate solution strategy, shortlist vendor options. Do scan the QR code on your screens right now. Apart from that, if we go to the next slide, here's some relevant research related to this Ask the Analyst. We've got our digital learning realities research, which has just opened. We've got the full Learning Systems 9-grid report. And of course, the bottom link is where you'll find all the other relevant research. So it just remains for me to thank Fiona Lettinen and David Wilson for their time. And of course, everyone who's joined this webinar for all your great questions and attention. Thank you very much. That's it. Goodbye for me. And Fiona and David, I'll see you very soon.
Thank you.